right, welcome back to another episode of Talking About Practice. This one is going to be a good one for you. We got some great theory, some awesome practical tips coming your way, and a conversation with Dr. Agarwal, who's really going to focus on what it looks like to have powerful teaching in your classroom, in your work with learners, and what that can transcend to in terms of achievement and success and all those different types of things. So, thanks so much for being on. We're happy to have you.
Thanks for having me, AJ. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so one of the first things we like to do with our guests on the show is just kind of hear a little bit about your background. You've written this fantastic book, Powerful Teaching, and we're going to get into that, but you've spent a lot of time working on what does it look like to actually impact the learning and the achievement that's happening, and what are some things you actually can do. And so I would just love to hear your story about like how you got into the science of that, how your research started, right? How you became a doctor, all those different types of things. Would love to hear your story and share it out with us.
I'm a cognitive scientist. I've been doing research on how people learn and remember for about 15 years. And I started getting really passionate about bridging that gap between research and education when I was in college. So in college, I was getting certified as an elementary ed teacher, and I started my career teaching 4th and 5th grade. And while I was taking my pre-service classes, I was at Washington University in St. Louis. And on one side of campus, I'd take all my education methods classes and my practica, my student teaching, and then I'd walk to the other side of campus and I'd take a bunch of neuroscience classes and psychology classes. And then I'd walk right back to the other side of campus and take my education classes. And, just over the course of days and weeks and months and years, I realized that everyone's talking about learning, but they're talking about them in different ways. And they have so much to say to each other, but there's this literal campus divide, and on top of which, there's so much that education could learn from psychology and neuroscience, and so much that laboratory-based scientists could learn from practitioners. And so it was one of those light bulb moments. I've always been jealous when people have those, and I guess I kind of had one.
Right.
And so it was one of those light bulb moments where it just kind of fit. And so I wanted to make sure that I had background in conducting rigorous research in how people learn and remember, and also forming my career again at the beginning as an elementary ed teacher, and now I teach college students, which I've been doing for quite a long time too.
I love it. And in your work with college students right now, what are you doing?
I teach college students at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. So I actually teach science at a music school with musicians. I'm not a musician, AJ. Do you play any instruments?
I am not. I was in a band for 6 years and never even played an instrument. It was just the writer, lead singer guy, just be brooding and that type of thing. But yeah, it's still all of my bandmates are fantastic musicians. I said I was just the lackey carrying the equipment.
Well, voice counts as an instrument. So.
They tell me my voice though.
Yeah. So I love teaching science and neuroscience and psychology to musicians. It's so relatable, and I see my 80 college students every day, and I love using these research-based techniques in my own classroom. And one thing I've been really enjoying at the Berklee College of Music in Boston is that the way the musicians learn and remember as musicians has really shaped the way I think about it from a research-based perspective. So a lot of what I talk about in my book, Powerful Teaching, this idea of retrieving or practicing your knowledge, right? Musicians do that. They have to practice their instruments. But then when I explain to them, well, in our class, we're going to practice our knowledge, they just look at me differently, right? So we have this concept, you have to practice a foreign language, you have to practice your bike, you have to practice on an instrument, but then the concept of practicing knowledge in a classroom is just so foreign as a concept to students and to teachers. So it's something I really love talking about with my music students.
Yeah, and I love that you put that out there, because a lot of times when people talk about practice, we immediately think about sports or music, or like those two kind of come to mind, because as kids, you're probably doing one, if not both of those. And you understand that, oh, it's time for practice, right? In both of those fields, that's what it's called when you go with your teacher or your mentor, your coach, and work on practice. In the classroom and just in learning in general, what does practice actually look like? What does that mean to you, that term, in education or learning environments?
For me, that practice component is using what you know. So one example is I give in Powerful Teaching that me and my co-author Patrice Bain really like, is asking people, and so I'll ask you, AJ, if you know the number of bones in the human body, the adult human body.
I do not.
Take a guess.
But
Practice.
I feel like it was like 226 or something like that.
Close. Do you know when? I'm just curious when you think maybe you learned that, or why you think it's 226.
I mean, I definitely feel like I learned it probably as a young kid and then learned it again in biology, and would definitely answered it probably correct on a number of tests, but have not retrieved that since I was a teenager.
Yeah. So for adults, the correct answer is that we have about 206 bones in our body. So I should...
Right there.
Yep, 206. So I should have the same number of bones as you. And by asking you to pull that information out, to sort of mentally travel back and dig around in your head and retrieve 226 or 206, it's what we call retrieval practice. You're retrieving, you're pulling that information out. If I had just told you the answer, then you wouldn't be retrieving anything. There wouldn't be a mental struggle. I would just be trying to get information into your head, as opposed to you actively trying to retrieve it and pull it out.
I love that. I love that. So, I've heard the science of learning broken down into 4 easy steps. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts on this. I've heard it starts with attention, then it moves to encoding, then storage, then retrieval. What are your thoughts on breaking it down like that?
I love all 4 of those steps. I think they're all necessary for learning, but I would say, based on my experience and my research, that it's not a linear process. You don't go from attention to encoding to storage to retrieval. They all affect one another.
Is there any other missing pieces in there?
Well, I mean, I like to say learning is messy.
Yes, all right.
So if you haven't slept, that's going to affect that whole process. If you have been exercising, that's going to affect the process. If you just spent a lot of time watching TV and you're trying to study, that's going to affect the process. Listening to music affects the process. So learning doesn't happen in a vacuum. And those 4 components, I wouldn't even call them stages, because I think that implies you go from one to the other. So for instance, when we retrieve information and pull it out of our heads, that affects the encoding. And that encoding helps us retrieve, and that retrieval helps us encode and helps things store. And you can't really retrieve without attention. You can't encode without intention. So it's all just mixed up. I think it's one big melting pot. It's not 4 concrete separate things. Now, as cognitive scientists, we can do research specifically on attention and specifically on encoding or specifically on storage. And that's where research is great, in taking these really complex things that humans are able to do and boil it down on the order of how fast does it take you. If I show a light on a screen, how fast does it take you to hit a button when you see that light? That's a measure of attention. But of course, in the real world, attention doesn't work that way, right? I've got my laptop, my cell phone next to me. I might be driving, I'm hearing something on the street. And so all of these things are happening simultaneously.
So it's interesting when you say retrieval practice, because I think in the example where you asked me how many bones and I incorrectly answered 226, it was close. It was a 206. So I feel really good about me searching my brain. But I think a lot of people feel like retrieval practice is just that, which is retrieving information. What does it look like on the application side of things? Like if I am driving and I drive to work every day, and there's those days where I don't even realize that I've crossed 4 intersections and went through 3 lights and I've just showed up there. But there's some application there, right? Am I still retrieving there? Is that still retrieval practice, even though I'm not pulling out some information? What does that look like in terms of application?
a few different components to applying what we learn and how that ties into retrieval practice. And one aspect is that a lot of research on retrieval practice until recently has been done in laboratory settings with very simple materials. We might bring a college student into the lab, show them a list of words, literally chair, table, bed, window, and then we ask college students to remember them, and then we have them spit it back out. Much more recently, a lot of research on retrieval has been done in authentic classroom settings. So I and my co-author Patrice have been doing research in her classroom, her school district for about 15 years. And there's been research in medical school, for instance, having medical students learn neurology diagnoses and working with patients, and looking at how retrieval practice can improve complex knowledge, like learning how to diagnose a patient. And so there has been a lot of research demonstrating, and it's intuitive, right? If you practice diagnosing a patient, you get better at it. If you practice doing CPR, you get better at it. Mm-hmm. And there are certain skills like driving or CPR or riding a bike where you do it often enough, you practice it often enough that it becomes sort of second nature, right? So another example that we start Powerful Teaching off with is where I was trying to walk from an apartment to a coffee shop. And I'm trying to get there, and I'm relying on Google Maps, and it's only 4 blocks away. And all of a sudden the next day I can't remember how I even walked those 4 blocks. But of course we know that after you get used to, let's say, a new job and you start a new way of getting to that job, eventually you pick it up and it becomes automatic. And this gets into what we call the distinction between explicit memory and implicit memory. So implicit memory just being things that we're not even necessarily aware of, remembering how to drive somewhere, and then all of a sudden you're there. Whereas explicit memory is usually what we're talking about in classroom settings, helping students remember names, facts, dates, key concepts from a novel they're reading, how to diagnose patients. Those are all explicit memory. But retrieval practice and all of these cognitive science-based strategies in Powerful Teaching have all been shown to improve complex, higher order learning, not just that sort of basic memorization.
Yeah, and I think for the folks listening right now, that's often in a lot of the fields that I work in project-based learning, I feel like a misconception. Right, a lot of times people think like, just retrieval practice helps with taking a standardized test, right, or something like that. But it's just not true, right? It helps with those complex tasks as well. I'm interested to hear what you think about, we had a guest on the show, Trevor Reagan. He founded the Learner Lab and Train Ugly, and basically he kind of pulled some of the research about the difference between random practice and block practice, and kind of what that looks like. Because a lot of times in schools, we spend a good majority of our time in block practice. We want to get better at something. We're going to keep on practicing on that one thing. In sports and in music, sometimes often it'll look a lot more like random practice, right? You're going to be playing the entire sport of basketball, which is going to help with your passing, with your shooting, right? All those different types of things. What does that look like in a learning environment? How does that play into the research and work that you do?
The examples you gave of blocking versus random, the kind of more random approach, and I wouldn't say random in a disorganized way, but random in kind of an intentional mixed up way is what we call interleaving. And so an example from the book Make It Stick, for instance, with Peter Brown, Roddy Roediger, and Mark McDaniel. Roddy was my Ph.D. mentor. They give this example of interleaving I really like, where you can imagine a baseball pitcher and a batter. And a batter is practicing how to hit fastballs, curveballs, and changeups or slow pitches. And if the batter knows that the first 10 pitches are going to be fastballs, and then the batter knows the next 10 pitches are going to be curveballs, and then the next 10 are going to be these changeups or slow pitches, then they don't, that's a blocked practice. They already know, okay, these first 10, I hit it a certain way, the next 10, I hit it another way. It's what I call plug and chug. But if it's random or mixed up, or what we call interleaving, then a batter literally and figuratively doesn't know what's coming at them. So they have to be on their toes, just like they would be in a baseball game or a basketball game, not knowing what to expect. So in the classroom, interleaving is really important, especially for skills-based learning. So math, I was tweeting with someone recently about drama and remembering scripts. I have a great example from one of my Berklee College students with music where she couldn't remember the lyrics to a song. And she kept singing it start to finish. And there's a lot of research as humans, we naturally remember the beginning of things and the end of things. So you might remember the beginning of a movie you just saw, and you might remember the end, but all the middle is kind of a haze.
Right.
And so with interleaving, when I had this student sort of mix up the order of the song, when I had her sing the lyrics for the third verse, and then the fifth verse, and the second, and the first, and the fourth, and then put the second half together, and then the first half together, she had it all in 15 minutes flat. And so by mixing it up, it adds this struggle to where, again, we have to retrieve and pay attention and focus on pulling information out instead of just kind of going through the motions. And so that's where you're right. We often do things in a blocked way, and a simple switch doesn't require more grading or more prepping. It's just even taking a problem set, and instead of just giving problems from chapter 3, is to mix in some problems from chapter 2.
And right there, you'd have the benefit of the interleaving concept that you were just talking about.
Right.
So talk about powerful teaching for a moment. Everybody out there, get this book. It's going to impact your practice and your work. I remember when, I first found like somebody like Dan Pink's book Drive, right? And it was this notion of that, there's intrinsic motivation outperforms extrinsic motivation. It was kind of like this aha moment for me because I had spent so much time as a teacher doing extrinsic motivation, right? Mm-hmm. And not enough time doing these other things that had a greater impact. When reading your book, there were some things that came to my mind that were aha moments where I hate the term return on investment, but you get a bigger bang for your buck when you're doing this type of practice as a teacher. What are those things, right? If somebody's listening at right now, like what are those things that you could do in whatever role, teaching, coaching, mentorship, whatever, that you're going to have that return that's a little bit better than if you're just kind of going out there and going through the motions?
One of the big things that, of course, as educators, we've all experienced is having to reteach something. Mm-hmm. So how often do we cover something in class and then 2 weeks later or even a week later, students just kind of give us the deer in headlights, a sort of like, wait, what are you talking about? Or I don't remember the answer, or that doesn't even sound like anything I've ever heard of. And then we have to reteach it. And of course, we know if we're, for instance, the 6th grade math teacher, we'll teach stuff, maybe pre-algebra, and then come 7th grade, and all of a sudden the students don't remember anything from 6th grade. And then when they're in 8th grade, they don't remember anything from 7th grade. And here we are just wasting so much time, and it's so frustrating and stressful as teachers to have to keep doing this over and over because students don't remember, right?
Retention there, right? We're like, where's the retention? I remember even having that, teaching a kid and then teaching them the next year. And I'm like, I taught you this, and I still have the
right. I know I taught you this. Yeah. And so if we can use the limited classroom time we have to help students remember more, they're going to be more successful. And I think part of that return on investment you mentioned is, as teachers, we don't have to keep wasting our time. We don't have to keep wasting students' times by trying to re-hammer things into their heads. We don't have to keep wasting time reteaching, so we can actually cover more content instead of less. So oftentimes, very understandably, a concern is, well, all this retrieval, getting information out sounds great, but how do I still cover my class content? In my opinion, and based on research I've conducted, is that if students remember more, you actually save time. You don't have to keep rehashing things out. So even when I meet some of my college students on Tuesdays and then see them again on Thursdays, if on Thursday they remember stuff from Tuesday, I can jump straight into a new topic, or I can jump straight in and keep moving on. I don't have to review, here's what we did on Tuesday. I can just ask my students, what's one thing you remember about Tuesday? Moving on. And it saves me time. It gets them engaged, that attention component, right? and it improves their long-term memory.
Yes. Are you just in terms of like, say you're working with, a couple teachers that teach different grade levels, different subjects. And this is always the hard thing when you're doing professional development or professional learning, is trying to find things that would work for a second grade teacher, a high school biology teacher, and a middle school, language arts teacher. What are some of those things that you would kind of harp on in your training that you think would work for them?
One of the reasons I love these evidence-based strategies, so we've talked about retrieval practice and a little bit about interleaving. Two more that we cover in Powerful Teaching are spacing and feedback-driven metacognition. So spacing, again, these are all intuitive and we're all great teachers. We use this stuff anyway. We could just use it a little more mindfully. Spacing is just literally spacing things out or returning to previous content. So somewhat often, especially in older grades and depending on the content area, we might teach something once and then assume students have got it. And just like we said, they have the deer in headlights, they forget. And spacing doesn't mean reteaching. It just means something like, for instance, on Thursdays, me asking students what they remember from Tuesday. Or on Thursdays, asking them what they remember from last week.
Just to check for understanding could be spacing.
Yeah. Yep. And then feedback-driven metacognition is important because when we give students feedback, which we do, then students improve their learning and retention. But a key component of that is a next step toward metacognition. So having students reflect on their own learning or thinking about their own thinking. So something so meta is that you're thinking about your cognition. It's metacognition. And all of those play into any of the content areas. So these four sort of power tools or evidence-based strategies, there's research on them ranging from math and science to the humanities and history and medicine and engineering and foreign language. And these strategies all at the basic foundation, the basic core of them work the same way. When students practice what they know, when they have to return to content and kind of bring it back to mind and make it fresh again, it's sort of content agnostic. It really doesn't, it's more about what students do while they're learning, and it's just so much more flexible than other things. So when I give workshops and talk with teachers, really it's not any different for if you're a second grader or a college student, and it's not any different if you are in a science class versus a humanities class.
I love hearing that because, I think a lot of times, we're like, does that apply to me? Here's my kids, right? That whole type of thing. Yeah. So I love, hearing that. It's what you do.
And
go ahead.
I do. So I have a website, retrievalpractice.org, and I send weekly emails to about 15,000 teachers around the world. I also have free downloadable guides. And so one of the guides I co-wrote with a cognitive scientist, Lisa Fazio, is specifically about early childhood education. So what does all this retrieval practice mean and look like, and the research and practical strategies for younger grades. So that's one of the few guides I have that's specifically at a grade level or an age. The other guides, again, are more broad in terms of content areas. I have an interleaving guide that's a bit more specific to math, but I have a retrieval guide, a spacing guide, a guide on research and practical strategies on how to help students transfer their knowledge to new situations. And those are all, again, very flexible regardless of grade level and content area.
And that's at retrievalpractice.org, right?
Correct, yes.
Awesome. I have 4 kids, all 10 and under, 10, 8, 5, 3. And I can see, right? So you see kind of how it changes as they get into school and kind of what that looks like with my 3 and 5-year-old versus my 8 and 10-year-old. So it's really interesting. I got 4 quick questions for you that we do kind of every time. And I try to tailor them to the guest. First question I have for you, and feel free to short responses. You're not going to hurt anybody's feelings by being concise. So first question I have is, what do you say to the folks that are out there that say things like, well, why do kids need to remember anything anyway? They got Google. They got their phone in their pocket. Like, what do you say to those people, right?
I would say that, yes, there's Google. I rely on Google every day. And technology is helping students think differently. They still need to know how to search and what to search. And maybe nowadays we don't need to remember basic facts. We can look up the date of when something happened, but retrieval helps with kind of even those higher order application sense of knowledge. So it's almost like assuming, oh, well, why do we need retrieval? Because we have Google. That's true, but retrieval helps with more complex higher order learning. So just because we have technology around doesn't negate the value of learning and remembering in complex ways.
Yeah, I'm with you. What do you think is the impact of technology and social media on the learning environment these days? We talked right in the bat, about how sleep and all those different types of things. What is your feeling on that?
One question about technology that comes up often is note-taking. So what about note-taking that's handwritten versus laptops? There's a study that came out now 5 years ago about how handwritten notes are maybe better, I'm air quoting here, but better than laptop taken notes. We know that students nowadays can type so fast that they're transcribing lessons when they take notes, and their notes aren't very organized. At the same time, the research is mixed. There have been replication attempts by my colleague, John Dunlosky, and they haven't been able to replicate that 2014 study. And this is a situation where, similar to these power tools in my book, Powerful Teaching, where I like to say, you do you. Whichever is easiest, it's more important that students retrieve, it's more important that we give them feedback, and it's much less important how they take notes so much as what they do with those notes to help them remember. So I talk about a strategy called retrieve taking in Powerful Teaching that can be done handwritten or laptops or notes.
I like that though. You do you, right? Because it's
you do you.
Yeah, for each person. I like that. You do you.
Yeah.
Third question here. What's the last thing you've learned personally that you weren't forced to learn? Like there's a lot of stuff like for our jobs that we have to learn. But what's the last thing you learned personally?
I'm not forced to do it. I am personally always working on my Spanish. I love learning languages and I love traveling, and I'm not bilingual, and Spanish is something that I learned in high school, sort of. I took like 3 years and remember nothing, and it keeps coming back, and I get a little better. And so recently I was watching this movie, Ralph Breaks the Internet, but I was watching it in Spanish. And so for me, that's something that no one forces me to do, but I enjoy that learning process. And I'm still uncomfortable with making errors when I speak Spanish with native speakers. But yeah, that's something I'm always trying to learn.
I love it. Did you have subtitles on as well?
I did. So I was listening to the audio in Spanish and English subtitles. A friend of mine who's a Spanish teacher did point out that maybe at some point I could listen to the Spanish audio with Spanish subtitles. And I'm not at a level where I could pick everything up, but that actually sounded like an interesting idea.
Yeah, it would be. I love hearing that. Always interested what people are learning and how we're learning, and it getting kind of looking through that process there. Last question we have for you, we ask everybody is, if there was one piece of practical advice that you had to give our listeners in terms of improving learning, improving performance, improving achievement, what would that practical advice be?
It would be to start small. There's 100 years of research supporting these power tools and these strategies, but again, they're intuitive. We do them every day, lots of different ways. So one tiny practical thing is, rather than starting class by saying, all right, class, here's what we did yesterday, or here's what we did last week, is to just turn it into a question. Okay, class, what did we do yesterday? What did we do last week? And providing all students silent time to think and retrieve. So with think, pair, share, for instance, we often skip the think phase and move on to the share and the pair. And just a simple switch from telling students and getting information into their heads to getting it out is really powerful for long-term learning.
I love it. I love it. Start small and just flip that opening, the statement that we all make, into a question. So
Exactly.
Doable. Everybody can do it. We already know about retrievalpractice.org, where we can find your guides and join your email list. We know about the book, Powerful Teaching. Where else can people connect to you?
I'm on Twitter at Pooja Agarwal. You can follow the hashtag Powerful Teaching. I've got a Facebook group all about powerful teaching in the book. We've got almost 700 members now from, I think, 40 different countries. And everyone is sharing their strategies and pictures from their classroom and retrieval guides and how they do metacognition. So the Facebook group is really active, on Twitter, the book, the email list, the downloadable guides. Those would all be great.
Very cool. So as I always say, you do you of how you want to follow Pooja and actually interact with her. You find your platform, whatever's going to work best. But thank you so much again for coming on here and dropping that knowledge. We appreciate it. It was awesome. And looking forward to hearing more about the book and your work in the future.
Thanks, AJ. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much.